Welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going to look at something I think we all struggle with, and that is how our brains deal with the constant flood of information. I mean, it can feel like sometimes that our minds, which were built for a much simpler time, are now trying to navigate the information equivalent of like rush hour in Times Square.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And you know that feeling of being overwhelmed, it's not just a modern phenomenon. We're going to be exploring how we try and sometimes fail to make sense of it all. And a lot of our guide for this is going to be the insights of Daniel Levitin's book, The Organized Mind, Thinking Straight in the Age of Information Overload, which gives us some really practical ways to think about what's going on up there.
And it's actually pretty amazing to look back and see that people have been struggling with this for centuries. I mean, even way back to like the 1400s with the invention of the printing press, which seems so foundational to us now. There were worries even then, like Erasmus talked about being swamped by, quote, swarms of new books that he thought were actually hindering learning.
Yeah. And those anxieties continued. You know, Leibniz worried about a horrible mess of books potentially leading us backward. And even Descartes, who was all about clear thinking, preferred his own direct observations to the sheer volume of existing texts. It was just too much effort to go through and find the useful bits.
Yeah. It really puts our current digital overwhelm into perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Even something as relatively simple as the dial telephone caused concern. People worried about remembering all those numbers. It makes you wonder if every major information shift brings its own set of anxieties with it.
It does. But, you know, the sheer scale of information growth today is really what makes it feel so different. Think about this. In 1550, we knew of around 500 plant species. By the early 1600s, that had jumped to 6,000, and today we're aware of 500,000. And in scientific research, it's just exploded.
It has. Levitin points out that just a few centuries ago, someone with a science degree pretty much knew all there was to know. Now, even a PhD in a very specific area, like the squid's nervous system, can't possibly keep up with all the new research. I mean, a quick search on Google Scholar shows there are tens of thousands of articles, and it's growing exponentially.
Yeah, and to really understand the volume, think about this. In just 1 month, January 2012, we created more new data than the estimated number of words in the entire Library of Congress multiplied by 50,000. So, you know, feeling a bit overloaded in this environment, it's completely understandable.
It is. So how does our brain even begin to process all this incoming information?
Well, it all starts with attention. Think of attention as your brain's essential mental resource. It's the spotlight that picks out what's important from the constant buzz all around us. It's how we filter everything and bring certain things into our conscious awareness.
Okay, so it's like a filter.
Right. And thankfully, a lot of this filtering happens without us even thinking about it, subconsciously. Imagine you're driving on a familiar highway. You're not consciously registering every single car that passes, every billboard. Your brain is filtering out all of that perceptual noise because it's not immediately relevant to your goal of getting to your destination.
So what makes that filter decide what gets let through then?
Well, Levitin points to two key things that stand out: change and importance. Our brains are incredibly sensitive to changes in our environment. So if you're driving on that smooth road and suddenly hit a patch of bumps, your brain immediately flags that as something you need to pay attention to.
Right.
Think of it like this. Your brain establishes a baseline of what's normal, the steady feel of the car, the consistent visual scene, and when something deviates from that baseline, your attentional system kicks in and pushes that new information into your conscious awareness so you can assess it and react if necessary, whether it's just those drainage ridges or maybe a feeling that your tire pressure is low.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But then that also means that sometimes our brain's ability to focus so intently can also mean that we miss things that are right in front of us if they aren't deemed important at that moment. And this is what is known as intentional blindness, right?
That's right. It's like our mental spotlight is so focused on one thing that we become blind to other things, even if they're quite obvious. There's a classic demonstration of this. It's often called the basketball Rimo video. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend looking it up. You know, people are asked to count how many times a basketball is passed between players on one team, and in their intense focus, they often completely miss a person in a gorilla suit walking right through the middle of the scene.
I've seen that. It's amazing how you can just not see it.
It is. It's a powerful illustration of how our focused attention can create these cognitive blind spots.
It really makes you realize how how selective our attention is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when something does get our attention, how does our brain actually make sense of it? How do we connect it to what we already know?
That's where the amazing power of memory and association comes in. Our brains use these vast networks of interconnected nerve cells to represent all the different characteristics of things. So think about a fire truck. One of its attributes is red. But in your brain, that concept of red isn't isolated. It's also linked to other red things, maybe cherries, stop signs, roses, and so on.
So like your brain has this enormous intricate web of connections. And if you activate the idea of red, it sends little signals along all those connected pathways, bringing related ideas to the surface.
Precisely. And this process of associative recall happens incredibly fast because it relies on electrochemical signals traveling within these neural networks. It's how we can rapidly access related information once a particular concept or attribute is activated in our minds.
Okay, so we've got this incredible system for taking in information and connecting it, but what happens when our mental landscape or even our physical spaces become cluttered and disorganized?
Well, Levitin uses a really relatable analogy here. Think about that one drawer in your kitchen, the junk drawer.
Oh, yeah.
It's filled with all sorts of things that don't really have a proper home. Random keys, pens that might or might not work, odd bits of packaging, things you probably should throw away but haven't.
Oh, I know that drawer.
Right. And our computers, Levitin argues, can very easily become digital versions of that junk drawer, only on a much larger scale. We end up with files we don't recognize, multiple copies of the same document, downloads we've forgotten about. It becomes this chaotic collection of digital clutter. In fact, he talks about his own assistant's computer. It was, filled with unidentified files and accidental downloads. He calls it a fantastically disorganized kitchen drawer full of electronic files.
I mean, that definitely sounds familiar.
Mm-hmm.
So with all this potential for things to become disorganized, both in our minds and in our environments, what fundamental tools does our brain have to bring some order to the chaos?
Categorization is absolutely fundamental. Levitin asks us to imagine for a moment a world without categories. If you looked at a plate of black beans, each bean would seem like a completely unique entity with no inherent connection to any of the others. The very idea that they're all the same type of food and equally edible wouldn't be obvious.
That's a really mind-bending idea.
Hmm.
We rely on categories so much that we don't even think about it. It's how we make sense of the world.
Exactly. And we categorize things based on different criteria. Sometimes it's perceptual, how things look similar. Other times it's conceptual, how they function in a similar way. That junk drawer again is a good example. You might put a pen, a pencil, and even a tube of lipstick in there because conceptually they can all be used to make a mark on paper, even though they look quite different.
And the junk drawer itself actually serves a kind of organizational purpose, right? It acts as this escape valve for items that don't neatly fit into any of our more established categories.
Precisely. And this act of categorization taps into something really basic about human cognition. We seem to be hardwired to enjoy knowledge and to naturally want to impose structure and order on that knowledge. We have this intrinsic drive to understand and organize the world around us.
That's interesting. This urge to categorize seems to be universal.
Mm-hmm.
Levitin points out how naming conventions for plants and animals show remarkable consistency across very different cultures.
What's fascinating is that independently across different languages and cultures, people develop systems of primary and secondary names, like think of fir and Douglas fir or apple and Granny Smith. This suggests a fundamental human tendency to see broader categories with finer distinctions within them. And this isn't just limited to the natural world. We see it in man-made objects, too, like chairs and easy chairs or knives and hunting knives.
And then there's Eleanor Rosh's concept of basic level categories. These are the first words children learn for things. They're the terms we use most commonly in everyday language. Things like car, bird, or chair, as opposed to more specific subordinate level terms like 1970 Pontiac GTO or Rufus-sided Towhee or a mahogany Queen Anne replica.
Yeah, and our level of expertise in a particular area often dictates which level of category we tend to use. So a birdwatcher will naturally use more subordinate terms like Rufus-sided Towhee, while someone less familiar might just say bird. But the act of categorizing at whatever level serves a really important purpose, what's called cognitive economy. We categorize to avoid being overwhelmed by a flood of unnecessary details. Most of the time, we don't need to identify the exact make and model of every car we see. The category car is sufficient for our understanding.
But we have the flexibility to shift our focus when needed, right? Like if you're sorting through those black beans to find the ones that aren't cooked properly, for that moment, you're focusing on the individual characteristics of each bean.
Absolutely. What's called our central executive, which isn't a single part of the brain, but more like a collection of mental tools, allows us to zoom in and out, shifting between focusing on the broad category and the individual items within it. Think of a painter focusing on the details of a single brushstroke while still keeping the overall composition in mind, or a composer working on a single note within the context of the entire symphony. They all have that overarching mental model, that ideal they're aiming for.
So our brains come equipped with these amazing organizational tools. But given the sheer volume of information we face, what can we do externally to help manage it all?
Well, this is where the idea of externalizing memory becomes so important, essentially offloading some of the burden of remembering and organizing onto the world around us. This isn't a new idea. I mean, even the ancient Greeks used external aids for memory, and modern neuroscience confirms how effective this can be.
We already do this in lots of simple ways, don't we? Like having a designated spot for our keys, or organizing our silverware drawer, giving things a specific place so we don't have to constantly rely on our internal memory to find them.
Exactly. Levitin mentions Ed Littlefield's simple but effective four-category system for dealing with incoming mail. Immediate action required, important but can wait, what he calls abeyance. Not important, but keep, for reference and throughout. Whether you use four categories or two, having a system for processing incoming information really helps to manage the flow and prevent it from becoming overwhelming.
And the simple act of writing things down is another incredibly powerful external organizational tool, isn't it?
Absolutely crucial. Writing things down frees up mental energy by reducing the cognitive load of trying to remember everything. David Allen, in his work on productivity, really emphasizes how our mind-wandering network is constantly vying for attention with our central executive, and uncompleted tasks tend to nag at us, pulling us away from the present moment. Getting those tasks out of our heads and onto paper or into a system frees up that mental space.
Levitin also talks about this surprisingly effective index card system, using 3x5 cards for capturing ideas, quotes, and sources. It sounds almost old-fashioned in our digital age, but he really highlights its flexibility.
What's so valuable about it is its simplicity and adaptability.
Yeah.
Each piece of information gets its own card, and you can easily reorder and recategorize them as your thinking evolved or your priorities shift. Levin even mentions how Phaedrus, one of Socrates' dialogues, might have been composed using a similar method, breaking down the complex task of writing a book into the manageable process of arranging individual slips of papyrus.
Now, what about organizing our physical spaces beyond just the infamous junk drawer?
Think about how things are organized in a hardware store. Fasteners, that's the broad, superordinate category, might get an entire aisle. Within that aisle, you'll find basic level categories like nails, screws, and bolts. And then within those, you'll have even more specific subordinate categories like concrete nails or wood screws. It's a logical hierarchy based on the properties of the items.
Right. So everything has its place based on what it is. But Levitin also discusses the idea of organizing based on function or association.
Right. Our associative memory plays a big role here. You might find laundry detergent not just in a general cleaning supplies aisle, but also near the laundry baskets and clothespins, things that are functionally related to doing laundry. This mirrors how our brains connect related concepts, making it easier to find what we need and even to remember what else we might need for a particular task.
It's interesting how retail environments often have a more intentional and logical organization than our own homes.
Exactly. In retail, there's a clear incentive to make things easy to find. In our homes, it's often more, organic. But the underlying principle of any good organizational system, whether it's in a store or your kitchen, is to provide maximum information with minimum cognitive effort. The real challenge, as we all know, is actually setting up and consistently maintaining those systems.
It definitely feels like an ongoing effort to keep the chaos at bay. So how does our brain itself actually facilitate this process of internal organization?
Well, Levitin explains that our brain isn't a single unified entity, but rather comprises distinct networks that can be active simultaneously, each handling different thoughts and priorities. For example, you might have one network engaged in thinking about what to have for dinner, while another is focused on the conversation you're having.
But it's not like there's just one thinking center that's doing everything at once.
Not at all. The attentional network acts like a kind of air traffic controller, constantly monitoring the activity of these different networks and allocating resources as needed. Think about when you're running. One part of your brain is monitoring your muscles and oxygen levels, while another is automatically adjusting your breathing, all without you having to consciously direct every single step. Consciousness, Levitin suggests, is more like a continuum, and when the activity in a particular neural network reaches a certain threshold, it breaks into our conscious awareness.
And there's a whole complex neurochemical process happening behind the scenes that supports our attention and focus,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. The prefrontal cortex, which is highly sensitive to the neurotransmitter dopamine, plays a crucial role in attention and executive functions. Other neurotransmitters like noradrenaline, glutamate, and GABA are also involved in regulating focus and managing distractions. There's even ongoing research exploring how genetic variations might influence these neurochemical balances and potentially relate to things like mood and even artistic tendencies. But it's important to remember that our understanding of these complex interactions is still evolving.
It's a remarkably intricate system.
Yeah.
And when it comes to those everyday frustrations like losing our keys, Levitin suggests it often boils down to simply not paying attention in the moment when we put them down.
Exactly. The key here is cultivating a bit of mindfulness, just being present and aware of what you're doing when you place things down. That small amount of focused attention helps the hippocampus, a key area in the brain for memory, especially spatial memory, to properly encode the location. Having external systems like a designated key hook reinforces this process.
And the hippocampus is indeed critical for remembering places. Levitin mentions the famous study of London taxi drivers who have to navigate a very complex network of streets and how they were found to have larger hippocampi compared to the general population.
And the discovery of specific brain cells called dentate granule cells, which seem to be involved in encoding new places, further highlights the brain's specialized mechanisms for spatial memory. Ultimately, when it comes to organizing our physical spaces effectively, even something like organizing tools in a garage, it often comes down to creating categories that are personally meaningful to us. And it's worth remembering David Allen's principle. Make the things you use most frequently visible and easily accessible, while items used less often can be stored away. Think of keeping the TV remote on the coffee table, but putting the instruction manual in a drawer.
Okay, so what are the negative consequences when this whole system of attention and organization gets overwhelmed or breaks down? What are the pitfalls of information overload and disorganization?
Well, that's when we start to see some significant negative effects. Multitasking, for example, has been shown to actually increase stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, and it can lead to a feeling of mental fatigue and fog. It can also create a kind of dopamine feedback loop where our brains get rewarded for constantly switching attention and seeking out novelty rather than sustaining focus.
It's like our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain we rely on for focus and planning, has this inherent weakness for anything new and shiny that grabs our attention.
Precisely. This novelty bias can really hijack our attentional resources. Constantly seeking out new stimuli becomes like empty-caloried brain candy for our minds, offering a quick hit of reward but ultimately detracting from the deeper satisfaction of sustained focus. Even just the awareness of an unread email in your inbox has been shown to temporarily reduce your effective IQ. And when we try to multitask, the information we're processing often doesn't get encoded in the right parts of the brain for effective long-term learning.
So what's the antidote to this kind of fragmented attention and the pitfalls of overload?
Cultivating the ability for sustained, focused effort is key. This can lead to what's often referred to as flow state, that wonderful feeling of being completely absorbed in an activity where your actions and your awareness merge, and you lose a sense of self-consciousness. Think of musicians completely immersed in their performance or athletes in the zone.
That sounds like a really productive and also very fulfilling state to be in. What are the conditions that help us achieve this kind of flow?
It typically requires a a good balance between the challenge of the task at hand and your skill level. If the challenge is too high, you'll likely feel anxious and overwhelmed. If it's too low, you'll probably get bored. As your skills in an area develop, the range of challenges that can induce flow also expands. So, experts often experience flow more readily because their well-honed skills allow them to perform certain aspects of a task almost automatically, freeing up their conscious attention.
And even completing smaller, less complex tasks can trigger a sense of reward in the brain, right?
Yes. Even accomplishing relatively simple tasks releases neurochemicals that make us feel a sense of satisfaction. This is part of what makes things like social networking so potentially addictive, those constant small rewards for checking updates and notifications. But the deeper, more lasting satisfaction in life tends to come from engaging in and completing more meaningful projects that require that sustained focus and effort.
So ultimately, managing information effectively in our current environment isn't just about tidying up our computer files. It's really about understanding how our brains naturally work and then learning how to work with those tendencies rather than against them.
Exactly. It's about becoming more aware of our attentional filters, understanding the power of memory and association, and consciously implementing external organizational strategies to help reduce our cognitive load and free up our mental resources for the things that truly matter.
This has been a truly insightful deep dive. It definitely gives you a lot to think about in terms of your own relationship with information. So for you listening, considering everything we've discussed today about the brain's natural tendencies and the constant influx of information we all face, what's one small concrete change you could implement today to feel just a little more in control of your own organized mind? Which of the insights we've touched on resonated most with you, and how might you see yourself applying them in your daily life?
And as we've seen, this deep dive has really just scratched the surface. There are so many more fascinating aspects to understanding and cultivating a more organized mind.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.